Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Beyond Words, the podcast where we explore the science and experience of language, music, and the mind. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, a speech-language pathologist, a musician, and a PhD student researcher. And in each episode, we'll dive into conversations with world-class researchers, clinicians, and thinkers to uncover how communication really works. From brain and behavior to sound and meaning, we go beyond the traditional boundaries to better understand what it means to connect, express, and be human through this amazing capacity of language. Hey everyone, how's it going? So welcome everyone to Beyond Words. Awesome to see you here, Greg. Long time no see. I'm the host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician, an SLP, and a PhD student. And I'm super excited that we have the one and only Dr. Greg Bryant with us today. Greg is a professor and the department chair of the UCLA Department of Communications, also one of my advisors, and his research examines human cognition and communication from an evolutionary perspective with a focus on vocal communication, music, emotional expression, and social signaling. His work explores how humans use prosody, laughter, infant-directed speech, and musical features of the voice to communicate meaning across cultures. Using acoustic analysis, behavioral experiments, and cross-cultural methods, Dr. Bryant investigates how vocal signals convey emotion, intention, and social connection in both everyday interaction and early development. He's also got some killing music. G Bryant on Spotify, check it out. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Most of these podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And just some disclosures, we each receive compensation from speech therapy PD, but there are no other non-financial disclosures to report. Yeah, so without further ado, Greg, welcome to Beyond Words. How you doing?
Thanks, friend. Thanks for having me.
Oh, super excited to chat. I always just ask the guests a bit about their origin story. And I was wondering, what got you into vocal communication in the first place?
Okay. Well, I've been a musician since I was a teenager and always had an interest in music. So I think that the origins of my interest stem from my interest in sound and music. And I kind of came from a non-professional musical background, meaning that my parents weren't musicians and nobody in my family is a musician technically, but they were all sort of into their audiophiles, so my dad always had a nice stereo and music was a big part of our household. And then I actually dropped out of college pretty early in my college career and decided just to play in bands, and I just worked random jobs and played in bands, and I started learning how to record. And so I'm kind of a self-taught recording engineer. And that was the origins of me getting into sound manipulation and how sounds affected us emotionally, and how I was really interested in how sound went with film. And so I decided to go back to school, and I pursued a degree in psychology at San Francisco State, and I took a psycholinguistics class. And in that class, I decided to write. I was actually starting to think about music experimentally at that time as well in other classes. And so I wrote this paper about language and music, really exploring the literature at that time, what the connections were between language and music. And that's sort of set me on a course that I'm still on to this day. I teach a class called Language and Music that still incorporates a lot of the ideas that I learned in that original paper I wrote. I kept writing the paper after the class was over, which gave me a little clue to myself that this was something I was really into. And then that was my first conference presentation. I presented the ideas in that paper. I didn't have data. I just had the theory about the connections between language and or prosody, in particular, musical expression, and then emotional prosody. And so then I decided I was interested in evolution at the same time. I got into evolutionary psychology, and I decided that I was interested in pursuing studies that looked at the evolution of vocal communication and music and how it related to music. And I do have a number of theoretical papers about music, and I have a few empirical papers about music perception. So that's kind of like a sub area of research that I do, but most of my research is on vocal communication. So I started a PhD program at Santa Cruz in experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, and then the emphasis was really on psycholinguistics. And my advisor, Jean Foxtree, studied spontaneous speech. So she was interested in how, what are the language production processes that happen in real time in ordinary conversations, right? So unlike the sort of corpus-based analyses that linguists use or prepared sentences produced by actors or whatever, psycholinguistics, in this case, spontaneous vocal production and speech production really emphasized how people talk in ordinary social discourse or whatever. And that resonated with me a lot. I was really interested in natural behavior, and we didn't really see eye to eye in the evolutionary part, but we were able to figure out work that we both were interested in. And I started studying how people use their voice to communicate indirect meaning, like sarcasm. And that was most of the work I did in that lab was on the vocal signals of irony. And that was kind of how I started the whole deal. And then when while I was studying irony, I really started getting into laughter and how laughter was functioning in interpersonal interaction. And then once I started my job here at UCLA, I really started studying laughter more carefully. And now I've been studying lots of different kinds of phenomena, but laughter has been a big part of my research program in the last 10 years. And yeah, that's kind of how I got into it all. It was really through the avenue of music, and then deciding that this was the domain of psycholinguistics and experimental psychology that I liked.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to pick up on the irony piece really quick, because I think prosody, like the musical aspects of speech, are so interesting and deep. And nobody talks about it in speech therapy, or it's like, this one little blip of thing that we do. Like one thing that kind of bugs me is that like in social, we do like a little bit of social pragmatic therapy with, maybe kids, autistic kids or something like that. And then, we teach the kids to like, you recognize irony by, listen to this tone of voice. Like, we're going to say it, really in this it's like a trope, of like, hey, nice shirt, or something like that. Yeah. And, there are a lot of ways that we teach that have these just, very over the top, kind of overacted, very unnatural, like things that your research kind of shows some of that stuff exists. Like there are certain tones of voice, right, that we use, but that it's way more context sensitive, and like, it's not really what's going on in conversation.
That's right. And it's one of the important that was the point of contact between my advisor and myself was looking at natural language production showed you a different picture than what you might see otherwise. So a lot of the work in at that time, actually still, that looks at prosody and irony is using actors. And then what you're doing is you're tapping into their intuitive notions of how these things sound, which we think are largely illusory. That you think if you understand somebody's being sarcastic and you have to report back how did they say it, you're probably going to overestimate the extent to which it's actually encoded in the voice. And I think the same thing's true for laughter and other nonverbal vocal emotions, and for emotional expressions and prosody, that your understanding of the meaning is going to retroactively change your estimation of what was in the signal itself rather than your understanding. So we think people sound sarcastic, and if you isolate them and analyze it, they're not. I mean, a little bit. When people use irony, they tend to slow down. That's the only thing I think that's really robust across different speakers and languages and stuff, is you slow down a lot.
I remember, I'm not sure if I'm misremembering this now, but that you'd maybe talked about like 4 different vocal strategies for irony.
Right, I have a chapter about that. Yeah.
That was really interesting. I feel like maybe it helps. I think it helps a lot of therapists to think a bit more, fine grained about these things instead of just these sort of like sweeping stereotypes, because I don't think we're doing irony justice or when we try and teach it. But can you talk about a couple of those strategies and how they might
Sure.
work?
Yeah, I mean, one, and this is just separating the idea of what is kind of traditionally called linguistic versus affective prosody. So you have global prosody, which is sort of the overall melody of a sentence, and so you can exaggerate all kinds of different aspects of that. You can make it louder, you can make it more high pitched, you can emphasize, I was going to say that. So you could change the melody in ways that work across multiple segments, right? And then that's like you think of as global prosody or affective prosody. Then you have what has been called sometimes linguistic prosody or local prosody, which is you do changes on single lexical items or syllables that then change the meaning, right? So if you emphasize one word versus another, you change the implied meaning of the sentence in different ways. And people use those kinds of movements just for asking questions and ordinary talk. People stress certain words to emphasize, to make the meaning, distinctive from another kind of meaning that you might have. So if you just emphasize the pitch or the loudness on one word in a sentence, you can make a 5-word sentence have 5 different meanings, right? So that's something that people that you will tend to use, and that's more subtle, but people will use that kind of strategy. Another strategy is to just produce some other kind of signal that helps mark the thing in context. So you can laugh before or after, which could help indicate that you have some kind of playful intent or you have some kind of alternative meaning. You can produce some other kind of word or sound, like you could sigh or go or whatever, that will also help people recognize that you mean some alternative thing. So those are the different kinds of things I talked about in that chapter of, all the different ways you can market with your voice. There's a lot of different ways, and that's why you shouldn't expect one ironic tone of voice, even though there could be a stereotype thing that people understand. It's not the way it typically happens in ordinary talk.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so crazy that effect of like, because when I think back, I'll definitely remember something being more exaggerated than it was. That's interesting.
I don't have actually
meaning,
data on it exactly. It's one of those things I just know is true, but I haven't shown it exactly. It would be something that could be a project.
That would be a cool. Yeah, that'd be a cool project.
I'm sure that would work. If that's the kind of thing where if it didn't work, you did it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. I feel like a big point for me as a therapist thinking and looking at your work and then thinking about like what we do, like a lot of the therapy materials, they kind of treat social communication like the more broad the musical aspects, for example, or like maybe even gestural, like raising an eyebrow or something like that, that it always has the same meaning, like, oh, when you see a raised eyebrow, that always means surprise or something like that. Or like this exaggerated tone, that means irony. But I just think that it's so context sensitive, and
everything is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even the perception of a phoneme, right? I mean, you could hear the same exact phoneme has completely different acoustic features, and then it has different, perceptual properties depending on where it lands in the sequence of speech sounds. Everything's context sensitive.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I feel like we really need to think more about the types of stimuli that we use to teach. Like maybe we should be actually teaching with real conversation more than these kind of overactive.
Maybe, right. Yeah. I mean, now you probably could use, this is maybe one of the positive things that AI could be used for, is that you have something that looks like a real agent but you can control all the parameters. And so you can sort of train people who might have some disability in picking up certain information, and then through some very controlled AI generated avatar or whatever, you could really start training people how to pick up certain cues.
Yeah. Yeah. It's getting a lot better. It's crazy. Like the AI before used to just have terrible flat prosody for everything.
Oh my God. Well, it's still unnatural. I mean, prosody seems to be the last domain where they're trying to make it sound natural, but I mean, it doesn't take much to make something obviously computer generated. I mean, one little slip of, a stress in the wrong place or something, it's easy to sound wrong.
It's so crazy when when I'm thinking about this too, like how sensitive, I think you've shown too that like they're just like millisecond difference between, like, if you're answering a question like, how are you doing today? And you like wait and you say good or something like that. Like just that small little gap can
Slight
totally,
pauses mean
yeah.
everything. I mean, yeah. Yeah.
It almost makes me feel like, man, is this something that can be trained even, or can you get better at it? It's so
Well,
complex,
all
like this
bets are off
feat of
now,
social
though.
reasoning. Yeah. So I don't know, but I think that at least in these ways we can get closer to strategies that are really based in real conversation versus kind of
Right.
these
I think that's
cartoon
important
versions.
because if you train people, or try to like give people some sort of, you know, um, just give them examples and they're not real, then then when people go into the real world, they're going to be completely baffled. It's like, this is nothing like what I was shown before. So
Yeah.
it's just, the problem is that real life behavior is very subtle. So,
Yeah.
uh,
I think that's the thing with a lot of teaching is that, like, the things that are really easy to teach, or, the things that you can easily convey or turn into a lesson, are rarely the things that are actually happening.
right.
Yeah. Well, um, I feel like prosody is kind of the bridge between language and music. And I also wanted to
Right.
touch on, some of the music stuff too. Also with infant directed speech, it feels like that's kind of a natural bridge too. But
Sure.
yeah, maybe with just this connection to music. Yeah. Why do you think, what is this big connection? You talked about like music and language. And I notice, there's so many, there's so many academics in the field that I meet that are, I feel like musicians are overrepresented there. And they have shown this like
I could be
language and music connection.
right.
But yeah, what do you think the connection is?
I don't think there's that many people that are obsessed with the language and music connection, which I guess is good and bad for me. But um, there are a lot of musicians in academia, which I have wondered about myself. But I mean, you could probably have a whole show on that. I mean, music training facilitates education, but it also correlates with upbringing and privilege. Who knows what else? Hmm. I think that, in terms of my own interest in music and the connection between language, um, what I've come around to believing, I actually kind of believe something that's close to what I originally believed, and then I learned a bunch and kind of came full circle back to it. But the origins of melody, I think, are in language communication. So the way, or at least vocal communication, not necessarily language, though language, I think, contributes in a major way to the music faculty. But I think of the music faculty as a collection of abilities that includes, um, you know, our our sense of rhythm, our sense of melody, which I think is derived from vocal communication, tool making, and our coordination, and there's aspects of the visual system that play into it, and other general purpose auditory processing, like auditory scene analysis. We have all these different abilities that sort of contribute to what we call the music faculty, and cultural evolutionary processes have sort of cobbled together these systems and created cultural products that then perpetuate on their own over time through cultural evolutionary processes. And the question is, to what extent are any of these abilities that contribute to our music faculty actually selected for music? So is there a proper, there's this idea of a proper versus actual domain in evolutionary psychology. And the idea is that the proper domain of a system is what is this, the thing that constitutes the actual, sorry, I start saying proper and actual, and then I say actual in a different sense. So the proper domain is what is the stimulus input conditions for a particular system, what it's been designed to process. And the actual domain is what is the range of stimuli that the system can process. So a good example is face perception, which we know, I think we can say fairly confidently, there are specialized areas in the brain designed to detect faces in the world. I mean, it's a little area in the visual cortex. It's really pretty well understood. And the face perception system takes certain kinds of input in order to process a face, and then either gets accepted into that system and it helps you recognize a face, or it doesn't. There's some flexibility in what goes into that. So, for example, a car grill will activate at parts of the face perception system. So it's got like the orientation of two eyes and then something below that's like a mouth. If you invert a face, then the face processing system tends to not process it. Similarly, if you invert a car grill, that doesn't activate the face processing system. But an ordinary car grill will activate that system. So we would say the car grills are in the actual domain, and that faces constitute the proper domain of a face perception system. So to relate that to music, there are different, we want to try to identify, is there anything that really is the proper domain is music itself, rather than some byproduct or some other system? And so the two areas that some co-authors and I have identified, and we write about in a BBS paper that was published a few years ago, is that rhythmic entrainment and vocal melodies in infant-directed singing constitute two kinds of behaviors that evolved that for music, in the sense that in the music faculty, we have the ability to detect emotions from melodies, and we have the ability to not only perceive isochrony and polyrhythms and other kinds of complexities in rhythm, but we can actually move along with them. So we have a perception action coupling with rhythmic stimuli where we can move along to it. That's a really special skill that very few other animals have. And the other animals that can be trained, no other animal does that spontaneously in their environment, but many animals can be trained to do it if they are vocal learners, meaning that they have an evolved ability to track acoustic properties and other sounds, and then be able to produce it with their own vocal system.
Like Snowball.
Parrots.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Or Snowball, isn't it a cockatoo?
Exactly. Snowball the cockatoo is a good example. So Snowball like moves contingently to music, and it's pretty good. It's not like just, sometimes the broken metronome is right, a certain amount of time. And Snowball knows what he's doing. And also, if Snowball is looking at somebody who's not dancing correctly, Snowball looks away. It's a really cool effect. So that, and cockatoos in general, it's super clear that they have that ability. You can train a sea lion to do it. Sea lions are not vocal learners, but a lot of the other species that are in the same clade as a sea lion do have vocal learning abilities. So there's a latent ability in a sea lion brain to do it. So humans have this in a way that no other species has. Some people have been able to train a bonobo to do it, but they're terrible. And so, and a dog, no matter how many treats and how long you train it, a dog can never move its paw contingently to a beat. It just can't do it. And it's because it doesn't have those mechanisms that allow perception action coupling. So I would call that the proper domain of music. That's a musical skill. And our argument is that coordinating physical and musical actions is a form of coalition signaling. And we could go down that road, but for language, I think the important connection is with not only that the voice seems to constitute a sound spectrum that's important for our concepts and cultural evolution of the chromatic scale. Scales seem to be derived from the voice spectrum. This is work by Dale Purves and Dan Bowling and others have shown that if you look at the voice spectrum in a particular way, you can identify the amplitude peaks that correspond to the chromatic scale. So it seems like sensitivity to that kind of spectral information has provided the sort of groundwork for the cultural evolution of scales, which is not just scales don't evolve in random ways. There are certain kinds of scales that reappear all the time, and certain options that exist don't. So, and then finally getting to the real point, what we're talking about is the melodies in emotional communication also seem to map on really well to the melodies you see in musical systems. So despite how you carve the octave up, which different cultures carve it up in different ways, they all are based on the octave, which is an interesting fact. But that the way that different kinds of melodies are constructed within a system of how you divide up the octave tend to have the same kinds of patterns that correspond to the patterns you see in emotional communication. sophistication. So
Mhm.
there's no, I mean, this hasn't been tested extensively, but the argument would be there's no musical culture where everybody thinks this is a happy song, and then any other place in the world, they'd say that's an angry song, or,
Mhm.
like recognize the musical emotions across different musical systems. And there's a lot of work showing that people universally can recognize lullabies versus dance music versus
Right.
like healing songs or something like that. Those distinctions are made pretty easily by people, no matter where you come from in the world. And that,
And it doesn't get better with age. I remember seeing that was quite a surprising finding that like when you're 3, like you're just as good as when you're like 12 or whatever at recognizing it.
yeah, it comes on early, and yeah.
Yeah, it'd be cool. Yeah, I was wondering if you had heard about the different rhythmic intelligences. They've like talked about like having beat keeping skills versus rhythmic patterning skills, and that they correlate with different aspects of language. So there's an association between rhythm ability broadly and language ability and reading ability. And for some reason, there's a difference between being able to keep a pulse and then like copying, a pattern. Like, so,
Okay.
if someone's like, copy this exact pattern, like, duh, 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 you can, that, like, tapping that out is like rhythmic patterning, and then feeling the pulse of like, duh, 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 where, feeling it in 4 or
Right.
whatever, like, that's a different type of skill.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's consistent with the view I'm sort of pushing here, which is that isochronic, that sensitivity to isochronic rhythm and your ability to move to it is a specialized thing that is probably separate in some level from something like another pattern recognizer that then you map onto a movement, or like if you have to repeat the pattern verbally, vocally, or some other way, or like match patterns or something. Yeah. So that's a different system. So in other words, rhythm production in the sense I'm talking about is not just a special case of pattern recognition.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Got it.
Oh, they could be related. I mean, evolution is a tinkerer. So it could be that, I mean, there's pattern recognition in all mammals have some version of pattern recognition depending on their ecology. And so that system might build on top of those mechanisms to some extent. It's not going to build something brand new. So maybe you could call it, it incorporates pattern recognition systems, but then there's some other thing that's separate.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Is this, um, related at all? You have like a paper on speech rate convergence, and coordination between people.
Right.
Is that is this rhythm, that kind of ability, related to how we converge?
That's a good question because it's not clear what the timeline would be of something like conversational entrainment versus your ability to entrain musically. They're probably co-evolved and related. But yeah, so in that paper, we show that you could think of speech as being a periodic, it's an oscillator, right? So I have a rate of my syllable production that it's not isochronic, but you could definitely say how many syllables am I producing per second, and that rate is, fairly similar across, one bout of speech. It's not like I'm talking really fast and then I slowed. I mean, people kind of talk at a fairly stable rate. And so what we found is that it's well known that when two people start talking, there tends to be an accommodation where they tend to converge in their speech. That's something that's been shown. That was shown quite a while ago. There's communication accommodation theory and other kinds of approaches that show people have a natural tendency to sort of move towards one another. There's some effects where one person moves and the other one doesn't. There's other effects like that. But in this study, we were just looking at how much does the extent to which people accommodate or converge in their speech rate predict how they will act in a behavioral economic game after 10 minutes. And so this originally was a study done looking at role of psychopathy in people's decisions in economic games and how it manifested in conversation. So this was that paper was published before, and I wasn't involved with that. But then in our analysis, we were looking at convergence, and then we also looked at pitch convergence as well. And then we looked at how these people would talk in triadic conversations. And then they were strangers and they would have a conversation for 10 minutes. And then afterwards they would be asked to play a prisoner's dilemma game, which is a game where you can either cooperate or defect. And then if the other person cooperates and you defect, that's the largest payout. And then if both people cooperate, that's the second best payout. And if both people defect, that's the worst payout. You don't get anything. And so it's a classic behavioral economic game that looks at, cooperation essentially. And so what we found is that people who converged more in their speech, meaning that not just how much they started off being the same, but how much did they actually move toward one another to be the same over 10 minutes, they were more likely to cooperate. And the one limitation of that study is that there was too much cooperation. So you need cases of defection. So people that people didn't defect enough. So it would have been more powerful if we had cases of defection, but we were able to show that the more people cooperated, the more people conversion to speech rate, the more they were cooperating. And so I think that shows that there is an entrainment in conversation. So we're tracking each other's syllable production, and then we start adapting to one another in conversation. And that sensitivity is reflecting that ability to that perception action coupling. So I'm sensitive to the speech production rate you're making, and then that affects the speech production that I end up producing. And it could index something about how well you can coordinate in other ways, so that's why people might use that as a cue to how well you could coordinate.
I think, yeah, so one thing that we do in social groups a lot is, we try and, because it's really tough to get the groups to cohere and coordinate and play games together and do all that kind of stuff. And so it feels like maybe a way to, or at least a feature to point out to kids. I mean, one thing that we do sometimes is play like music games together. Like maybe that helps with like entrainment and cohesion, but also like maybe, pointing out that matching a partner's like sort of speech rate or rhythm
Right.
is something that can help with, signaling that you could be, you're trustworthy or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, the one problem with that is that these systems are sort of under unconscious control, and that when you start trying to deliberately do it, you're going to do it in a weird way. And effect. So there's research looking at things like behavior matching, where, in a conversation, if you tend to imitate the other person's behavior a little bit, like if you go like this, then I go like this, and crossing legs and other things, those things can make another person like you more. But if you do it too much, then people notice that and it makes them like you less. Though then there's other research though showing that if you deliberately ask people to coordinate their actions, that seems to promote positive social feelings, regardless of whether they know you're instructed to do it. So there is something about coordinated rhythm that is sort of immune to those negative effects of noticing it. So behavior matching is different than coordination in that way. So maybe it would, if you could train people to coordinate better, then they might end up having like better rapport with the people they're communicating with.
Yeah, it'd be awesome to find something like that, because it is so difficult, thinking back to the social pragmatic therapy stuff. We have to fall back on these like kind of, rules, or like, hey, you should try and match the partner's behavior. And,
Right.
and that
Like a
often,
simple trick
like
or
you're
something.
saying, yeah, like it doesn't work all the time. It's like so context sensitive, and,
Right.
depends on how much exactly,
Or if
yeah,
they're trying too hard, then it could have these other kinds of negative impacts.
right. Yeah, definitely. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
But at least I think maybe at the very least, understanding that there is a lot more subtlety in real conversation that we're often missing, like by teaching a rigid rule about something. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Yep.
I wanted to talk to you about like, it feels like all of this is kind of connected, but like input directed speech, and is something that's like, a lot of speech therapists think about. But it's kind of a, interesting phenomenon. Is it just like a cultural Western thing? Is this universal?
Definitely not.
So
Yeah,
I know you have a cool study with like the Schwar people. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I think that's
sure.
pretty neat.
I mean, I think that this is something I studied fairly early on, and I've been interested in it for a long time, and there was always this sort of idea that some cultures didn't have infant directed speech, which I struggled to believe. And there was a couple early papers that showed it in a very terrible way. And I don't need to get into the details. I just wasn't convinced by it, and so I did a study with Shuar people in Ecuador in the rainforest in collaboration with Clark Barrett, who's an anthropologist here at UCLA. And we went down there, and it was a perception experiment, just seeing if people could not only tell whether people are talking to infants or adults, but what kind of intention category were they conveying. So they can tell could they tell the difference between like a prohibitive versus an attention getting utterance versus a soothing utterance, um, and people were really good at actually distinguishing between the different intentions and could clearly tell if a person was talking to a baby or an adult. And I've got a couple other papers showing it in some other cultures. And then now, more recently, we have a paper where it's a meta-analysis looking at every single study, doing acoustic analyses of infant-directed speech, and showing that the same patterns show up everywhere can look in dozens of cultures. So it's super clear that everybody around the world produces special kinds of speech properties when they're talking to infants, and that it's, I think, really detectable. The cases where people think that there isn't infant-directed speech are cases where there are cultures where people don't talk to babies very much at all.
Mhm.
And they'll even tell you, why would you talk to a baby? They can't understand you. There's no reason to talk to them. And so there is a lot of variability in how much people talk to babies. And that's different than if they do talk to babies, do they use a special tone of voice? And so in places where they don't talk to babies very much, they're still communicating with babies in various ways, singing to them or producing little short utterances that they might not immediately think of as talking to the baby, but they are vocally communicating with the baby. And so what you see is that when they do it in ways that are pretty common across cultures. It's just a matter of volume, really. I mean, volume meaning amount. I mean, some places really don't talk to babies very much. And I mean, I've spent a couple months working with Shuar people down there, and I barely saw anybody talking to a baby. So, and here, I mean, mothers are talking to babies all over the place. I mean, and so it turns out the U.S. is one of the most um, it's the place where people talk to babies more than anywhere in the United States. So the Schwar versus United States is they're on both opposite extremes of how much we talk to babies. But I think everywhere you go, there is some incidence of infant-directed speech. And it's obvious why you would do that. If a baby is not able to use language, they can still recognize the important acoustic signals that are going to give them information about the speaker's intention. If you want a baby to stop a behavior, you can't just say stop the behavior. You have to, and then that reorients their attention, and it inadvertently kind of inadvertently meaning it accidentally interrupts their behavior. It's even though it's designed to interrupt their behavior, the reason it interrupts their behavior is because it gets their attention.
That's the mammalian startle reflex, right?
Exactly. It's just the startle reflex. And so that ends up stopping the behavior. And so then that will kind of culturally evolve as a way to stop a baby from doing something that you don't want it to do. And then if you want a baby to stop crying, then you have to kind of downregulate its emotion. And you can do that by inducing this certain kind of calmness through your own voice, right? So you'd expect soothing vocalizations to have the same acoustic properties no matter where you go, because they're all babies that are upset and crying. And there's not a lot of room for cultural variability there. So I think where the cultural variability lives is who talks to babies and when. We have some work looking at fathers' infant-directed speech, and that seems to be a little different. So there's just all these pragmatic rules about talking to babies. That's where the cultural variability lives. It's not in the acoustic features of when people actually do talk to babies.
Yeah, interesting. I was thinking about this idea. So, like, given that these acoustic features of the sound, like the melody of mother trying to be soothing versus like saying no, like given that those, carry this meaning, do you think that that's helping kids get the meaning of words? And then maybe even more
Right.
broadly, like how much of an acoustic signal, maybe is beyond the sort of arbitrariness of the sign argument, like these, acoustic features of the words actually are pointing to some type of meaning.
Yeah. I mean, that's the classic debate in infrastructure speech, is to what extent is it actually functioning linguistically? Is that what you're getting at here? Like,
Yeah.
to what extent are there?
Yeah, I guess there's some people that say like, oh, you shouldn't, just talk like a normal person to your baby.
Right,
Don't
baby
use
talk.
infant speech. But, how much of that might be, helping kids get some sort of meaning out of, the signals that they're receiving.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a complicated issue. I mean, one thing we show in this meta-analysis is that there seem to be pretty universal patterns in the developmental timing of infant-directed speech, and that different kinds of features emerge later, which suggests that there's early emotional communication functions that then sort of transition into potentially more linguistic functions. So one linguistic function I think is pretty robust, that I believe is a real thing, is learning the vowel space of your language. And so if parents emphasize, or caregivers or whatever, emphasize the vowel categories and produce them slightly wider than they normally exist, and that helps young children, these are kind of not quite infants anymore, they're getting to be a little bit older. They start sort of calibrating to the vowel categories a little bit. I mean, we're still talking about less than a year old, but so I guess they're infants. But I think that learning vowel categories is one of the functions, and that's not just an emotional communication thing. Now, some people have made the case for, and I'm not convinced of this, is that infant-directed speech can function to help kids learn syntax. The problem with that argument is that the relationship between prosody and syntax is not really stable. So the cue validity is not great for learning syntactic boundaries if you're using just pitch, for example, or even, any prosodic cue doesn't really correlate with the syntax sufficiently to actually help. And so I think now you can get somebody on here that would have more expertise about that particular issue and tell me that I'm wrong. But my understanding is that the cue validity is not good enough for that to be one of the functions. So it seems like the prosody and the vocal behavior in infant-directed speech is more about emotional communication and vowels.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's like a better model because it's longer and stretched out, and
Right.
like if you're talking, it all the sound it gone instantly. But if you can kind of stretch out your speech and have
Right.
bigger pitch range, things like that, it's a better model.
The baby talk, I mean, there was this whole movement of like, don't produce baby talk, and I've always found that strange. But one thing is that obviously when kids get older, you have to have age appropriate emotional communication, right? When you're talking to an 8-year-old, you want to be, do you need to blah, 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 blah? I mean, you don't need to talk like that to an 8-year-old, and so, there's age appropriate prosody. So, I mean, that's what I think people are really objecting to. But in terms of saying just talk like a regular person, it's like you gotta kind of spoon feed some things a little bit at first, and so there is evidence that it actually helps, acquire the phonetics of your language by just producing it a little slower and a little more exaggerated at first, and that helps like bootstrap the process, and then it's a developmental facilitator. But obviously, if you talk like that for too long and too late, then it gets weird, and then there could be weird emotional communication stuff that is not right. I think that's people's objection, but the idea you should never use infant-directed speech to me is crazy. I mean, you should.
Yeah. It's definitely like, it feels like it's like you're saying, a better model in the beginning, and like conveying this, like, all of this more obvious emotional stuff.
Yeah.
that needs to be
And
conveyed.
it's too much of a good thing, of course you can overdo it or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. What about the other idea of this sound, kind of like the Kiki Boba effect, where,
Sound
if
symbolism,
you,
yeah.
like there's something about Kiki that sounds like more spiky versus Boba is like a, more round kind of. So
Right.
do you think that there's anything in the acoustics of, just in general that will point to meaning?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we are really readily willing and able to map acoustic features to other dimensions, other modalities, right? So you can, and so I think this has played a role in the cultural evolution of languages and lexical um, evolution. So, you know, words that sound a little bit like the things they refer to are going to um, be selected over ones that don't on average. Now, there's still arbitrariness, but it's certainly not purely arbitrary. I mean, nobody believes it's purely arbitrary anymore. If you believe that, you're just not reading. But the question is, to what extent is there arbitrariness? And it's like, there's clearly some arbitrariness, but I think that the closer you look, the more you see sound symbolism, even in subtle ways in the phonetics of words and what those words refer to. And the Kiki Booba effect is super robust. I mean, that's been shown cross cultures. You can use other kinds of examples. I think there's even non-human animal research that shows that there can be associations in that way. So I think that we're only beginning to understand the extent to which sound symbolism is playing a role in not only people's perception of words, but how those words evolve culturally.
Yeah. Wonder if there's anything in like how we learn language that, like, for example, like Kiki, like the K sound is like itself, it looks spiky. So, maybe these subconscious things that we've done to help people learn these mappings a little bit more easily. And I just wonder how much
Yeah.
of that is like well aligned in pedagogy, let's say, and how much are we kind of like accidentally maybe working against ourselves, if that makes sense.
You mean in terms of the way we teach people how to speak, or?
Yeah. Or just like, any like language learning. It seems like if you imagine,
It's probably not utilized very much. I don't know. That's a good
I
question.
don't.
I'm not sure. Um, I do know that, I mean, you could just look at the spectrogram of both those words and you can see the analogs to the shapes that people use. I mean, the K sound is, it's a lot of high frequencies, and so it just pokes out as a spike, and so you can just see that visually in a spectrogram. I don't think anybody's ever done that study, but I bet you people could categorize spectrograms without knowing the words. They would just know this one is more likely to be that one, and this one's that one. And that, I think, is kind of the core perceptual phenomena that we're talking about. People can hear the edges, and so it's really easy to map it onto a thing. Now, how much that's been used in different kinds of ways to teach people to speak, as far as I know, it hasn't. I think it could be fruitful, depending. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, just kind of a future thought. Yeah, but this stuff. Yeah, it's so interesting. When you get down into the weeds of acoustic analysis, like there's so much there that we don't think about when we're just looking at. I think as speech therapists, we tend to think of letters or words and not the raw acoustic signal, but there's probably so much there. I mean, you've done so much with it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Linguists have been neglecting that for a century, I mean, this idea of pure arbitrariness, for people to assume that was correct. And I think it's just, you can see once it's pointed out a little bit, it's obvious that's not right.
Yeah.
There's really cool Marcus Perlman and Bodo Winter, who have done a lot of cool stuff with sound symbolism. And
cool. Yeah. What have you learned from looking at, acoustics, bioacoustics? What takeaways do you have from doing all of that, kind of the dirty work of looking at the waveforms?
Well, I guess, mm, I mean, one important thing I think I've learned is that um, just because a sound is actually physically present doesn't mean it's perceived. And again, we go back to context. It's like context is huge. And so you have a lot of aspects of the sound that either are obscured by the context or that we don't perceive for different reasons. And that there are the other general auditory principles of masking and other things that, like psychoacoustic modeling that has allowed something like the MP3 to exist, has shown that you can toss out most of the information and still have almost an exact perceptual experience.
Wow.
What the physical characteristics are, which is what a spectrogram shows you, and then what we hear are often quite different. And I learned pretty early that you could edit speech pretty heavily in various ways, and it would be undetectable. You can take out chunks. You can, I mean, there's so much stuff you can do to speech and can't hear it. And I've become pretty, I think, skilled at editing speech. And in that process of learning how to edit speech, I really learned how much you can get away with that people hear. And it applies to music as well. And so the whole concept of, I'm not sure how much you know about the history of the MP3 or how that was developed, but when you have an MP3 file, you're basically tossing out about 80% of the data to make an MP3 that is indistinguishable from its uncompressed wave counterpart. And people have different opinions about that. And you can be trained to hear an MP3 because there's certain artifacts and high frequencies and other things. But I mean, even an MP3 that's, encoded at a pretty high rate, you're still losing about 75%. You're tossing out about 75% of the acoustic information. But because you keep right 25% based on psychoacoustic model figured out, you have a perceptually indistinguishable thing when you're tossing out 3/4 of the information. That's provocative and reveals something about how perception works, and it also shows that the physical stimulus is just one component of a complicated system.
Well, it seems like it's active, like, the perception, like we say perception and action, but it's like receptive language. We always think like we have this expressive receptive distinction. We talk in speech therapy terms, and like, it's just making me think like, man, receptive language is so active. It's like a really, you're doing a lot of processing there to get, because most of the time people talk, right? Like, just like we were talking about before, they aren't using those like really specific tone of voice signals for everything, or, like they're probably not, like the phonemes are probably messed up here and there. I'm probably using bad grammar when I'm talking now even, and like you're still getting most of what I'm saying, or like hopefully all of what I'm saying.
Probably didn't. I didn't even notice that. But we're really we're tuning to a higher level than, sometimes you could focus on those low levels, and then I'll notice every mistake you make, and there can be different pragmatic reasons you do that. But we don't notice a lot of this stuff. You could say completely wrong words, and I don't even notice. I just hear the word I assume that you're producing. And then if it's not that word, and then, okay, if you go back and look, it's like, oh, that was the wrong word, but I didn't notice. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so cool. So
one study showing that you could, in a speech stream, you could take out, I can't remember what percentage it was, but they would do it a paradigm where they would just, every 20 milliseconds, they'd slice out 20 milliseconds. And then they would increase that to like every 20 milliseconds, just slice out 50. And then, people, even when you take out, I think it was up to 3/4 of the signal is missing, you still have complete intelligibility. You can understand every word. Now you can tell there's sounds funny, still hear the words. It could have been even as much as only have 10% of the information, and then you barely are have any kind of impact on your intelligibility. You can still understand every word in the sentence, and you're missing 90% of the signal. And that shows that there's what people like to call top-down processing that allows you to infer the gaps, so to speak.
Yeah, that's how reminds me of how they train some of the language models with they use masking to basically train. They take out some center word or something in some of the sentences in a corpus, and they just have it guess over and over again.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if that's like a helpful way to work on receptive language. I don't know. Food for thought for people. Greg, thank you so much, man. This is like, it's awesome to chat. And we got just a couple minutes. If anyone has questions, free to ask. We do have to take off. I heard that there's another one that is going on at 3:30. So yeah, anything that you feel, most excited about now, something that you're working on that you want to share?
Well, I've kind of been shifting my attention a little bit to non-human animal stuff. So, my postdoc, Mathilde Messinet, is from France. She's working on play vocalizations in canids. So we're doing, that it's kind of considered to be a homology to human laughter. So the reasons that we play, the reasons that we vocalize during play is to communicate your intent to play, and that it's not actually aggressive, which means that the likelihood to escalating to aggression goes down a lot. And so laughter has this function. And so play vocalizations in non-human animals have this function. And so we're looking at it in dogs and foxes and trying to figure out if there is some connection between domestication and the sound and function of play vocalizations. So that's kind of cool stuff. And that's just directly related to my laughter research, but in non-human animals. And I have some other work looking at play vocalizations across species and what kind of evidence exists. And then my current grad student, Gabby Scholar, is looking at the vocal repertoire of gibbons, which are small apes.
She presented in lab. It was so cool. The duetting was amazing.
Yeah, so they do this duetting, which is, I think a related behavior that could be relevant for human musicality, and that is coordinated displays that are territorial signals. And so my work with Ed Hagen, we published a few things about this, looking at how early musical evolution could have been driven by a need to signal coalition quality and territoriality. And so the gibbons are a nice example of an animal. They're monogamous mating pairs that do coordinated duets, and you can infer information about their relationship based on the coordination features. And so, yeah, we're looking at that as well as other vocalizations they produce. They're really amazing, beautiful animals that have a crazy vocal system. So that's, and lately I've been more into the world of non-human animals a little bit, but yeah, got a few other projects going on. Human vocalizations, vocalizations during sex is a project, and vocalizations, screaming, and vocalizations that communicate something about your strength and formidability. And yeah,
cool.
Like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. This was super fun, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And cool. Yeah, if anyone wants to get involved, can they look you up? Is there a spot for finding you online?
I was looking at the comments. It just occurred to me there are comments here. Yeah, so if you go to gregbryant.org, that is my main website that links to not only my academic work, but my music site, and you can hear my album. And that's where you could find me, and then my email address is there if you have any questions or whatever.
All right. Thanks, Greg. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, everyone. Take care. And see you in the next one. Bye, Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.